Korean, so I may be wrong, but I have a firm confidence as a Japanese observing Korean discussion. There is a Korean paradigm in which to interpret things happening in Japan, particularly things are concerned with these conservative things. And I think that paradigm is entirely misplaced and wrong, if I may. And as long as Korean side is stuck with that particular paradigm, there will remain fundamental limits to the progress, which would otherwise be achievable. I may be too provocative, but I have that observation. And that may relate to some of the points raised by Professor Che. For instance, he said, but in reality, conservatives are backed politically and including the remaining elements of the emperor system. And this is Korean paradigm. And I don't see no relevance in terms of the relationship between the existing emperor system and the rise of conservatism. And Japanese political conservative arguments, yes, are backed by some segments of society, but not because of their ideology or philosophy. And largely because they share the same kind of frustrations which political conservatives tend to feel in observing a Japanese situation, not anything beyond. So to that extent, the reality which Professor Che would like to see is not in fact a reality as far as I'm concerned. And well, I don't think I mentioned the middle power in my argument, but I'm glad this has become so popular in Korea. So in response to your two specific questions, those questions I think arise as critical, again, because of a Korean paradigm. For instance, quest for a permanent membership of the United Nations has nothing to do with Japan's quest for a so-called traditional great power status. The fundamental motives among those who are promoting this idea is, well, there are several things, but one of the representative things is no taxation without representation. And the sense of frustration of being, being excluded from the critical decision-making process within the doors of the UN Security Council. And in the end, Japan will be asked to pay. And so that sort of frustration was one of the central sources of frustration among those who felt membership is critical for Japan. But this issue itself has been controversial and is still controversial in Japan. And so many, Koizumi, for instance, used to be a strong advocate of arguing against the Japanese search of this membership. He was against this concept. But as a prime minister, he read the statement written by the foreign ministry people. And the content in which the Japanese government is looking for this status, among those who support this concept, are still not as alarming as Koreans might to believe. In reality, government is arguing for a status without veto, and of course without nuclear weapons, and even less than that of France and UK. And I think Korean natural mindset would be Japan seeking this position is Japan seeking a status equal to US, China, Russia. No, not at all. No elements whatsoever. Even less than UK and France. That's the kind of real substance of our proposal in search of this. And here again, the kind of Korean paradigm to see itself as encircled by the so-called four great powers. I think that's a source of confusion, if I may. Is Japan same as US and China? That has to do with your second question. I think the burden of proof is on your side rather than my side, if you want to say Japan is on par with US and China. Why and how? Here, history question becomes very important, I understand. But that is not, in my view, quite relevant in terms of their realities today. And US and China are two independent so-called great powers. And China is a small universe on its own right. And the US is a world superpower. So that relationship is critical strategic relationship, no question about that. And Japan exists in between. And there are no indication of anybody in Japan wanting to be on par with the US-China in terms of real politics, in terms of great power politics. No. if that implication that you tend to get from our conservative arguments, that responsibility is for them. That's not what they are, in fact, seeking necessarily. But equally important is their sense of neglect or lack of awareness that they are giving, their discourses are giving those implications or impressions or convictions to observers of Japan. They are not aware of that almost entirely. That's, to me, that's an irresponsible part of our conservative arguments. But that's a reality, very unfortunately, in Japan. So this trilateralism among US, China, Japan, it's not a trilateral relations among the three equal great powers, no. No such agenda. And Japan's agenda would be, for instance, confidence building between China and the US-Japan alliance, and maybe Chinese future developments. In the economic field, there may be agenda of critical importance in a global sense, but no elements of equal condominium, condominium among equal powers. And on this issue, too, there is a division of opinion even within the foreign ministry. I've heard quite a number of Japanese foreign ministry officials, vehemently, vocally against this concept. What are we going to do with the US and China? We will be submerged, under that strategic relationship. And so those, Korean people questioning the importance of these are not necessarily, resonating our sense of agenda, sense of problems, if we address them in our paradigm, Japanese paradigm. And so I think filling that gap is very critical for my dream to come true. But in reality, I think that is not necessarily easy. So in that sense, I'm not optimistic, maybe pessimistic, but I'm optimistic in the sense that what Koreans people tend to believe critical hurdles between Japan and China are not necessarily real. So in that sense, I'm optimistic.
Thanks very much. We now have turned to the audience here and seek your questions. Please introduce yourself, and if you're focused on, if you're asking a question of a particular person, indicate who you're asking it for. Sir.
Hi, I'm Nick Cole from University of Southern California, and my question is about the obverse of memory, which you haven't really talked about. I suppose Don talked about this to some extent, and that is forgetting. And it strikes me from what you're saying that for everything that is remembered bad about somebody else, something is forgotten which is bad about oneself. And Don spoke at the very opening of his remarks about the difficult history of things that happened here on Jeju in 1948, and I think that there are equivalents for all of the countries represented here, where there are bad things that happened at home which can't be spoken about, and sometimes by turning to a problem connected to a foreign power, it provides a way for pain to be spoken about, and almost one's own pain from a domestic hurt can be explored safely without the political implications. But I wonder if the panel could respond to this question of what is being repressed by an overemphasis on international memories.
I can mention something that is clearly, as a Korean historian, I'm well aware that Koreans have pretty much forgotten how many Koreans collaborated with the Japanese during the colonial period. There's a belief that only a few people collaborated, and that's impossible. The Japanese could not have governed Korea without the cooperation of many, many Koreans. And so when they want to, like you say, what you do is you try to cover up divisions in the past, and any problems you have, obviously were not caused by those internal divisions, but were caused by meddling outsiders. And this is a problem, getting people to remember what has been forgotten.
Okay, let us turn then to another question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. 연세대학교 최정근 교수입니다. Hi, my name is Jong-kun Choi from Yonsei University. I've got one general comment and one clarification question to Soya Sensei. Actually, obviously the memory conflict in Northeast Asia is obviously a well-known issue. But I think the more interesting question would be, why does this repeat, within what and where, what context? I think that, we tend to only focus on sort of identity of each country, but I think that we should more focus on sort of relational identity. I think that there's a dynamics between sort of former subjugator and former dominator. And then it essentially comes down to the question of reconstructed memory that perceives today's intention of my former subjugator and my former dominator. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to the sovereignty issue. Because the conflictual memory issue is hugely, really hugely magnified upon on the question of territoriality. I think that, because the territorial issue is highly linked up with the history issue, because when you have conflictual memory issues and then territorial issue, then your intention is somehow confirmed from the eyes of the former subjugator. That's why we really think seriously of Tokdo issue, because we think it's a mere reflection of Japan's intention, at least in public domain. I guess my clarification question to Soya Sensei was that I really enjoyed your talk, because you reflected upon the domestic dynamics of Japanese politics. And one point of your presentation, you said Korea should not become a prisoner of political conservatism, or rise of political conservatism in Japan. And I totally agree. But as an analyst, my question is this: how do we differentiate political conservatism and the government of Japan? Because technically speaking, for the last 40, 50 years since the end of the World War II, the political conservativists ran the country. I mean, obviously, we might have the change of the power within 3 or 4 months, because, empirically speaking, many conservativists in government made so-called non-diplomatic comments about the Korea past. I mean, obviously, their audience may be targeted at the Koreans, but I guess if their intended audience was so-called Japanese conservativists, then how do we differentiate sort of political conservatism that runs the country and the political conservatism per se in Japan? All right, thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that's a very important and a good question. I do not equate both of them. And Japanese policies, if you look at the substance, are still being governed, processed, and in fact decided by what you call the Japanese government. And the political conservative leaders are not necessarily happy about those things. So they complicate the process. And bureaucrats in charge of the governmental policies, have to be careful about the influence of political conservative people. That's true, yes. But that doesn't mean that political conservative people have, hijacked or, have changed the course of diplomacy. Still, they are just one of the factors. And for instance, Abe saying he had to, abide by the Murayama statement. Murayama statement being made so seriously by the conscientious, Japanese political actors. To strike such a compromise is not easy, because of our diversity of opinions. But still, that was possible. And a prime minister having maybe different ideology, having to comply with that officially, I think that's the nature of the relationship. And I think that's the nature of the impact of political conservatism. And so to see the former political conservatism as beginning to dominate, I don't think that's how it should be looked at. Still, our real substance of policy are being conducted on the basis of post-war premises. For instance, nuclear thing is a clear example of this. Japan's lots of money, energy, human resources are being paid in solidifying non-proliferation regime of nuclear weapons. No question about that. That's the central focus of our foreign policy. But people don't talk about those things as an explanation of Japan. But whenever a nuclear argument comes up, people just jump at it. And so that's problematic very much. Maybe that's one of the indications of complications coming out of the combination of the two trends that you, I think, correctly observed.
Okay, thank you very much. Question there.
Thanks. My name is Timo Kivimäki. I'm from Nordic Institute of Asian Studies, University of Copenhagen. I have a comment, if I may. I think I would like to congratulate the organizers of the panel and the organizers of the Jeju Peace Forum for starting with such a controversial topic. I think this is important because of three reasons. First, I mean, East Asia has been a relatively peaceful place for the past 3 decades, but it hasn't been very good at tackling difficult issues and resolving conflicts. And yet, of course, in order for that current East Asian peace to be solid and stable, East Asia needs to tackle difficult issues as well. Secondly, with democratization, it will not be possible to suppress difficult, divisive issues anyway. So if Jeju Peace Forum manages to kind of lead the way to a constructive confrontation, tackling of divisive issues without becoming divided, I think that's a clear contribution to peace. And thirdly, I think part of this East Asian peacefulness has been related to the fact that East Asian countries are almost all very obsessed about economic development, and war is bad for business. So that's why there has been very little actual political violence. This developmentalism is about to change, I would say, because there is a tendency in all countries which are becoming more prosperous that suddenly you have generations who have no understanding of economic hardship, and they take prosperity for granted, and that's where East Asia will lose this focus on development, and once that happens, it's good that East Asia can tackle the difficult issues because of the fact that then part of its strength, part of the strength of its peace will be gone.
Thank you. Although your assumption about a kind of common process of modernization, globalization that leads to more similarities is well accepted. There's the element of traditional national identity and how it's been reinforced and how it influences historical memory, and the focus on the state from the Confucian tradition and beyond is very intense. And so it would seem to me it's a lot harder to achieve that transition that you're describing than it was in European countries and elsewhere. Also, that may be related to the fact that in the pre-modern era, particularly the last centuries before countries opened in the 19th century, East Asian countries became more inward-looking. There was less regional integration than even earlier, and that may reinforce the focus on single state authority that we think is much weaker in parts of the West. Another question? Yes.
John Swenson Wright, University of Cambridge. I had 2 questions. One, essentially a practical one, and then a second, which is in a sense more conceptual. Gil Rosman mentioned in the course of his remarks the role of government and the role of academics in addressing some of these complicated issues. What we haven't perhaps talked about in great detail, although I think Professor Yang alluded to this, was the role of culture. And culture is often presented as, or cultural exchange is often presented as a unifying force in terms of ameliorating some of these tensions. But as we've seen in the depiction of some of these controversial historical issues in the context of film and also manga, it's also equally important as a role of division. And so my practical question is, what role should academics be playing in terms of explicitly addressing that problem? Because it seems to me that often we have two distinct communities working in tandem, but not together. In other words, the dialogue is not taking place between these two communities. What role should we be pursuing as academics in explicitly addressing these historical shortcomings in terms of the representation of the past in film and other media? And then conceptually, I was struck by a remark that Dr. Ham made in her commentary about the role of irrational and emotional factors in explaining the difficulty of resolving some of these issues. And perhaps it's that irrational and emotional component that helps to explain the degree of pessimism that we've heard today from a number of the participants, which raises a broader issue methodologically. How should we be modeling or explicitly addressing those emotional and irrational elements? Because perhaps it's a function of our social science traditions that have encouraged us to believe that those issues can be tackled rationally. Is there a alternative disciplinary framework, whether it's psychology at the individual or the collective level, that can help in addressing those problems? Because as Professor Young, I think, was highlighting, there's a desire to move beyond the identity between the individual and the nation state to something larger, a cosmopolitan idea or a regional expression of regional identity. But none of that seems to be working, and part of the evidence of that is our concern with national rebranding, some of which is obviously going to be discussed at this conference. Is there an alternative context in which individual identity can be tethered to something both bigger and more stable than the existing framework of national identity or even regional identity? And what sort of disciplinary framework can we use to approach it?
Would someone like to respond to part of or all of the question? It's a big question. Please.
Thank you. Well, it's a big question. I just talk in my view. I should say in another way. I think the tendency of historical research and history education in China experience in way like this. Previously, focus on political history. Then with developing of economy, history research and education focus on economic history. Then it turns to culture history. And currently, more emphasis on social history or something like social studies. That's the developing tendency and also happened in history education. I think that might provide a way. When you are teaching history, the focus is changing. The education students got is different. Previously, what we were focused on is how. Just describing the process of history. Now, if we can focus on why, then the understanding of history will be changed. And that could be the better way for the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, John's questions are maybe perhaps too British, and I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but let me respond in 2 points. One is, I think the role for academics is firstly self-reflection of your own reality and understanding the other. And I somewhat criticize the Korean paradigm in my comments, but that is real here. And complaining about it doesn't make any point in terms of actually dealing with these problems. So for us to understand that is very important. And the lack of that understanding, I think, leads to so-called insensible comments and causing huge repercussions on the part of Korea. And also self-reflection is, of course, very important. I mean, when I talk about these things to my students, they do not really understand, intellectually what the meaning and the realities about Japanese conservatism necessarily. They share some kinds of frustration with them, yes, but their intellectual capacity to comprehend doesn't go beyond that. But if I explain that, they understand. And so those are things that we can do mutually. And that's a role of intellectuals and maybe the function of these kind of dialogues. And secondly, somewhat indirectly, I think understanding the importance of our relationships in a true strategic sense from your own point of view, from the point of view of our national interests. I think that would make a difference in the way we deal with these issues. And I have a strong view that Korea-Japan relationship will continue to be very critical for both countries, for our own national interests. If something unstable develops in this peninsula, in the Korean peninsula, I mean, again, this is my middle power theory. U.S., China, Russia have their own independent military capabilities to deal with the instability, but Japan doesn't. And Japan and Korea, has to operate under those premises. I mean, 3 independent nuclear military powers dealing with Korean developments. But Japan is clearly not in that group. We have to cooperate. By cooperating, our agenda will be, our interests will be much, much greatly enhanced. And if this kind of understanding of strategic importance of each other is shared by both peoples, hopefully by the governments, the way we deal with history issues may become different. Today, our conservative people do not think Korea is important, and many Koreans do not think Japan is important. And so you are not bothered much, even if your relationship will be hurt by this kind of so-called history problems. You will be bothered, of course, but if you think the relationship is of critical importance, I think that's the case, then things might develop otherwise.
Thank you. I think there is a sort of hidden transcript here. From my own perspective, destatization or degovernmentalization of the history issue is a hidden transcript. In other words, when the Goguryeo issue erupted between South Korea and China, the Chinese government immediately asked the South Korean government to accept the thesis that it is only a scholarly issue. It's an academic issue. So leave it to the scholars to resolve. And of course, South Korean government accepted it, although later they regretted it because they weren't sure about the intentions of the Chinese government. But then again, if we leave all this issue to the scholars alone, nothing is really done. As was mentioned by another panelist, if you, let's say, develop a common history book, let's say, talking about regional history or global history, but there is no real audience for that book. If there is no real audience for that book, how can an issue be resolved? And if we leave the issue to the scholars alone, I heard a lot about what happened in the discussion meetings between Korean scholars and Chinese scholars over the issue of Goguryeo. They shouted to each other. They have dinner, they have some wine together, and they departed, they return home. Nothing really changed. And again, another issue is NGOs. What can NGOs do? Of course, Japanese NGOs did a lot of contribution to reduce the number of schools that adopted the problematic textbooks. But nevertheless, the percentage is increasing. In the case of China, you don't really have NGOs which can defy the government orders. So if we just leave the whole issue to non-governmental sectors, I do not really see how much of progress can be made in this particular issue. And as Professor Yang commented in his presentation, history in East Asia is basically a state narrative. So as long as it remains a state narrative, efforts to destatize or degovernmentalize would not be an effective way to do it. That's why I emphasize in my presentation political leadership with determination is very important. Thank you.
In response to, one quick comment, in response to your view of the two forces that we really have to take into account, popular culture as well as academia, I would say we probably have more than that. Although I would agree with the notion the state narrative is dominant. But we have, on the one hand, the political commentators who are not academics, but who drive much of the debate because they write much of the material that arouses emotional thinking. We have the internet, and we have the popular culture and academia, and it seems to me academia has become a lesser force. All of the others have been building up, And so we have to take that into account in trying to figure out how to manage these issues. Question over here. Yes, you're right. Miss.
Thanks for the interesting presentations and discussions.
Your name, please.
And yeah, my name is Su-Young Yang from Stanford University. And as a person who studies about subaltern memories represented in films or soap operas, I personally have a question to Professor Baker. And from your presentation, I actually felt the need to see those gray areas in those modern histories and understand those relative memories of Korea, like among Korea, Japan, and China. But in doing so, I actually felt that it's really hard to make a judgment about those wartime, those historical problems. Because, like, for example, the deed of one historical figure who is considered to be a traitor, like when considering his, like those historical backgrounds and all those things, that we cannot really tell him as a traitor, or, you know, that kind of problem often happens. And but still, those governments of Korea, Japan, and China are talking about those wartime responsibility and stuff. And I think that would not, they would keep continuing doing that, like for their interests as well. And I was just wondering then, what would be an alternative standard for asking those responsibility for the historical problems, an alternative standard of the judgment that can overcome the controversy of the nationalism among those three countries?
It's a very difficult question. As an historian, I like to see history get away from blaming individuals and instead look for the impersonal forces which drive history and often drive history in unfortunate directions. There's a tendency, again, to personalize those evil people over there in Japan, in China, in Korea who did this, and that's why it happened. If we can somehow focus the attention on impersonal forces, non-governmental forces, then maybe we can have a less emotional look at history. But you talked about somebody seen as a traitor. Let me bring up one example from the Morning Korea Times. This is the 100th anniversary this year of when a man named An Jung-gun pulled out a gun in Harbin, China, and shot one of the founders of modern Japan, Ito Hirobumi. An Jung-gun in Korea is a hero. Chinese are now, according to the morning paper, are seeing him as a hero because he shot this evil Japanese. I very much doubt he's treated as a hero in Japan. He's probably considered a terrorist. I'm not sure how you can reconcile those different views of An Jung-gun. A man who, to Koreans, he shot the evil man who engineered the annexation of Korea, but to Japanese, An Jung-gun is the evil man who shot one of the founders of modern Japan. And so there are certain problems in history that I'm not sure you can reconcile. Maybe go the way you want, go towards the history of the common people, what Koreans call Minjung history. And maybe we can work on that for a while and kind of ignore the stuff at the top that causes so much controversy and see what the different peoples of China, Japan, and Korea have in common.